All right, good afternoon, students. I am going to be recording our third lecture for our World War II unit. So please grab your notebook and be prepared in order to take notes so you can get started on our Google Forms as soon as possible after the fact. So obviously we have a new screen background. So if you can guess who the screen background belongs to, you will receive a little bit of extra credit on your homework assignment. So I will duck out of the way real quick. Okay, give you a look. So please be prepared, and I will start our lecture now. So I'm going to try this a little bit different than we had in the past. So I'm not going to go into presentation mode with the PowerPoint. So this way I can annotate on the PowerPoint if I need to. So go ahead and write down our title, Japan's Pacific Campaign. Our essential question for this is, how did Japan continue to expand its empire throughout the Pacific, and how did the US respond? What I would like you to do is to create a flow map, kind of a flow chart of the Japanese military attacks and how they fared in each one. I want you to identify particular battles that mark turning points in the fight over the Pacific. And then I also want you to be able to discuss how the United States fared against Japanese or the Japanese attacks. Our objective, as I can state, how the United States was officially pulled into World War One. Okay, if you are ready, then let's go ahead and get started. Okay, so first off, it's important to start with the idea that the United States had been not wanting to go to war, although they were aiding the allied countries in Europe through the Atlantic Charter. They were trying to stay neutral. But the United States would be eventually brought into the war, not by Germany, who they were waging a proxy war with in the Atlantic, but by none other than the Japanese. Now, the Japanese dreamed of creating a vast colonial empire that included China and the entire South Pacific. And they felt that there was only one country that could really rival them in the area, and that was the United States. The Japanese began their southward push in July of 1941. By taking over French military bases in Indochina, now Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos. And obviously, France was in no position to fight back because they had been conquered by the Nazis. The US protested this new act of aggression by cutting off trade with Japan. As we know, Japan is a very small island, and so therefore can't really support themselves for goods, and so this was a big blow to the Japanese. The embargoed goods that the Japanese could no longer get from the Americans was one that they could not live without, and that was oil. They needed oil to fuel its war machine, specifically for plane engines, for aircraft carriers, for other military ships, and so this was extremely problematic. The Japanese military leaders warned that without oil, the Japanese would be defeated without its enemies ever actually having to strike a blow, because they would not be able to actually mobilize their war machine. The leaders declared that the Japanese must either persuade the US to end its oil embargo, or they would have to seize oil fields in the Dutch East Indies, now Indonesia. So in October, the Japanese general, Hideki Tojo, became the new prime minister of Japan. What this meant was that you had a militarist, Tojo, who was a general, running both the military portion of Japan and the civilian government in Japan. And so now the military was in firm control of the Japanese government. Shortly after taking office, Hideki Tojo would meet with Emperor Hirohito, and he would promise to make a peace attempt with the US. And he noted that if peace talks failed, Japan would have no choice but to go to war. So on November 5th, 1941, the day that Tojo's envoy flew to Washington for peace talks, Tojo would also order the Japanese Navy to prepare an attack on the US, essentially saying that they weren't going to have any sort of peace with the United States and that an attack was going to be imminent. Obviously, that attack came. And that attack came on December 7th. Early in the morning, a Japanese dive bomber would swoop low over the U.S. naval base in Pearl Harbor on the Hawaiian island of Oahu. And the bomber was followed by 180 more Japanese warplanes that they launched an attack on the six aircraft carriers that were, or sorry, they launched an attack from six aircraft carriers. And as the first Japanese bombs found their targets, a radio operator flashed his message: an air raid on Pearl Harbor. This is not a drill. And for an hour and a half, the Japanese planes would barely be disturbed by the U.S. anti-aircraft guns and blasted target after target. And by the time the last plane soared away around 9:30, the Japanese attack would be absolutely devastating. For Japan, the attack on Pearl Harbor was a stunning victory. The Japanese Navy had all but crippled the entire U.S. Pacific Fleet in one blow. Its own casualties only numbered 29 planes. In Tokyo, the elated Tojo would visit a shrine to thank the spirits of his ancestors for the favorable opening of the Japanese campaign to rule East Asia. The surprise attack decimated the United States. It sunk or badly damaged 18 ships, and about 350 planes had been destroyed and several damaged, as many of these planes were shot on flight decks, not able to actually get into the air. Some 2,400 people died in the attack, and another 1,178 had been wounded. These losses constituted more damage than the U.S. fleet had suffered in all of World War I. Luckily, U.S. aircraft carriers were out on patrol or out on a mission prior to the attack, and so were not damaged, which preserved the United States' ability to actually fight back. So here is pictures of the attack on Pearl Harbor and the sinking of ships such as the Arizona. And this is a picture of the Japanese plane. It was called the Japanese Zero. This would be their fighter plane in the war. The Japanese Zero was noted for its immense one-way speed. However, it was not noted for something that is very important for a fighter jet, especially at this time or point in time, which was its maneuverability. Now, the next day, FDR, President Roosevelt, would address Congress, and he is most famous for his lines, "Yesterday, December 7th, 1941, a date that which will live in infamy." He said, "The Japanese launched an unprovoked and dastardly attack on American soil." He then would go on to ask for a declaration of war against Japan, which Congress would quickly approve. Now, 3 days later, because Japan was declared war, or the United States declared war on Japan, its allies, Germany and Italy, would declare war on the United States, and the United States would now find itself in war with three different people or three different countries on two separate continents. After the bombing at Pearl Harbor, the Japanese would go on to seize American held territory of Guam and the Wake Islands in the Western Pacific. They would then go on to launch an attack on the American Philippines. And in January of 1942, the Japanese marched into the Philippine capital of Manila, where they overwhelmed combined U.S. and Filipino defenders on the Bataan Peninsula in April, and in May on the island of Corregidor. Now, the Japanese would also go on to hit the British, seizing Hong Kong, invading Malaysia, and by February 1942, the Japanese had reached Singapore. And by March, the Japanese had conquered more than 1 million square miles of land with about 150 million people. So they had attacked every major European country that held territory within the area. They attacked the French with French Indochina. They attacked the Dutch in Indonesia. They attacked the British in Hong Kong and Malaysia. And then obviously they attacked the United States with Hawaii, Guam, the Philippines, and yeah, so forth. So the Japanese were very successful early on, and they definitely were giving it to the Europeans and the Western forces. Now, all of this allowed them to feel very much like the Germans, victorious and invincible. Nonetheless, the Allies, mainly the United States and Australia, were very, very anxious to strike back at the Pacific Fleet. So the United States wanted revenge, and so what they did was they sent 16 B-25 aircraft or bombers off of an aircraft carrier under the command of Lieutenant Colonel James H. Doolittle to bomb Tokyo and a few other major Japanese cities. What they would do is they would fly off the aircraft carriers, land in, and then refill in China. The bombs didn't really do much because obviously 16 bombers is not a lot of payload. But what it did was it was a psychological victory for both the United States and Australia, and psychologically damning to the Japanese, because it proved that we could attack them and that they were vulnerable. Now, while there was other skirmishes that also proved that the Japanese were vulnerable, the biggest one that really kind of pushed the tide backwards would be the Battle of Midway. Now, the Japanese next target was the Midway Islands, which is midway between the Philippines and Hawaii. And basically, it was home to a key United States airfield. And what this would do, it would cripple the United States' ability to attack anything in the Pacific. So by 1942, a Japanese code had been broken, and as a result, the new commander of the U.S. Pacific Fleet, Admiral Chester Nimitz, knew that the force of over 150 ships would be headed towards the Midway Islands. The Japanese fleet was the largest naval force ever assembled at the point in time. It also boasts the largest battleship, carrying Admiral Yamamoto himself, the leader of the Japanese forces. Yamamoto planned to seize Midway and finish off the U.S. Pacific Fleet. He hoped that the U.S. forces would come from Pearl Harbor to defend the island, and therefore he could destroy everything. Nimitz was outnumbered by 4-1 in both ships and planes, but even so, he was preparing an ambush for the Japanese. Now, this is why no sailor ever believes that the world is in fact flat, because of what Nimitz did in this battle. On June 3rd, the U.S. forces hid behind the horizon. Obviously, there's nothing to hide behind within the middle of the ocean, so they basically went as far enough away from Midway that you could no longer see their ships over the horizon, hence the curvature of the earth, hence the world is round. Nimitz allowed the enemy to launch the first strike at the islands, and only at that moment in the first wave did he launch planes from the first carriers attacking Japanese ships. Only the first wave of planes was off of the aircraft carrier's decks, and so therefore many Japanese planes were still on the deck, and that meant that they were already neutralized. The strategy was a huge success. The U.S. pilots destroyed 322 Japanese planes, and they destroyed all 4 aircraft carriers and 1 support ship. What this basically did was cripple the Japanese fleet. They had put everything that they could into this battle, and they lost in a humiliating way. Yamamoto would order his fleet to withdraw, And by June 6, 1942, the battle would be over, and the Battle of Midway would officially turn the tide of the war against the Japanese. Now, if you look at this map here, this shows you all of the different ways in which the Japanese began launching attacks on American forces, specifically Midway. Here is Midway down here. Here's the Marianas Islands over here. Here are the Hawaiian Islands over here. There was one other attack on American soil besides the attacks on Hawaii, and those were the attacks on the Aleutian Islands here, which is the Aleutian Islands are an archipelago that comes off of Alaska. Those would be the only other attacks on American soil and North American soil during the Second World War. Now, here we go. On the left, we have Admiral Chester Nimitz, and on the right would be Admiral Yamamoto. Now, Midway was bad for the Japanese, and it basically turned the tide against them, specifically for the fact that they could no longer provide a really strong naval presence in the South Pacific, which obviously, being mostly water, was problematic for the Japanese. So with the Japanese fleet badly damaged, General Douglas MacArthur, the Allied commander in the Pacific, developed a plan to go on the offensive. What his plan would be was the idea of island hopping. What island hopping is right here. Oops, my bad. What island hopping is essentially going from one island to the next. And the whole point here was that they would attack islands with weaker defenses while avoiding more heavily fortified ones. This island hopping would allow them to sort of skip around and then isolate the heavily fortified Japanese islands. And it would also save time, and it would also save tons of lives. Now, the first target of the island hopping campaign would be the island of Guadalcanal, where the Japanese were building a new airbase. Now, if they completed this airbase, it would give them once again, an ability to launch attacks at American forces in Hawaii and also through the Philippines. So on August 7th, 1942, thousands of U.S. Marines and Australian soldiers would storm the island. The initial assault allowed the Allies to seize the airfield and quickly destroy it before the Japanese were able to call in for reinforcements. Unfortunately, victory would not be that easy because reinforcements would arrive. The battle would rage for a full 6 months before ending in February of 1943. This would be horrific fighting in the middle of a tropical island with the tropical heat blaring down on both sides. Both sides would dig in on this volcanic island. In the end, the Japanese forces would end up losing 24,000 of their 36,000 soldiers. That is a death rate of roughly 2/3 of the soldiers, before eventually surrendering the island and dubbing it the Island of Death. Now, fighting would go on for the next 2.5 years, but what the victory would mark would be the beginning of the end of Japanese forces. Now, even though this would be the beginning of the end, they would not go out without a fight and something very, very brutal, but this would start basically their descent to the end. Okay. My last slide got cut off, so we'll go back up to the first slide, which, if you would please go back to your notes. To finish this off, I would like you to write a summary capturing the essential question. I would also like you to review the notes, and I would like you to go to the Google form and address the objective. Okay, so thank you very much for listening in to us this afternoon. Please make sure that you go ahead and take care of your Google Forms. The due date for the Google form will be posted on the website. All right, and if you have any questions, please come to office hours on Tuesday morning. Okay, and if you have any questions or if you would like to do a Zoom meeting, please message me. Okay, thank you very much, and I look forward to hearing from you.